In the last 2 months, PSA has been grading at a rate of 26,000 cards per day. And all those bulk submissions that people were going crazy over last year, they're coming back now. The question I think we all need to be asking now is, are vintage Pokemon cards still rare? Whether you're a collector or an investor, one of the worst things that can happen is you spend thousands of dollars on a card because it's rare, and then every man and his dog grades their cards, and that card you spent a lot of money on becomes common. And because it becomes common, everyone's listing it on eBay, everyone's putting it up there as an auction, and the price over time comes down, because naturally an increase in supply equals a decrease in price. And to go against common beliefs, Pokemon card supply is not fixed, because when you look at Pokemon card supply, particularly in the vintage market, we're not looking at the raw cards. We're looking at the graded cards. That's the only number that actually dictates supply. So that's constantly going up as people are finding their collections and grading their cards. So in this video, we're going to be diving into the data and having a look at how populations of popular vintage Pokemon cards have changed between 2017 and 2020, when things are a little bit quieter, and then between 2020 and 2021, when there was lots of hype and everyone started grading their cards. And I think there's some pretty interesting insights that you guys are going to want to stay around for. If you enjoy these kinds of videos, please consider clicking that subscribe button and also that like button. It really does help a lot. Naturally, we're going to start off with the first edition base set Charizard. And now, if you have a look in 2017, it had a population of 519 in a PSA 9 and 114 in a PSA 10. Now, the population of PSA 9s increased by 25% between 2017 and 2020, and increased by 5.5% between 2017 and 2020 in PSA 10. Now, between 2020 and 2021, it increased by 6% in a PSA 9 and 1.5% in a PSA 10. Now, there's nothing that interesting about that profile. It's actually remained very steady from 2017 through to 2021. But there's one interesting thing to note. I always thought first edition base set Charizard was actually a pretty common card, but just because it was so iconic, it kept its value. But if you look at this population profile, particularly for a PSA 10, you'll see that only 6 were graded in a PSA 10 between 2017 and 2020. And then only 2 were graded as a PSA 10 between 2020 and 2021. And that is an insanely low number. I think to start with, first edition prints were actually very limited. And so a lot of people who had cards as kids diving into their closet to grade their cards aren't going to be sitting on a first edition base set Charizard. They're genuinely very rare. And then the other thing is, I think even back in 2017, the first edition base set Charizard was a particularly expensive card. So when PSA grades it, they take a lot of care in making sure they're giving it the right grade. It never got caught up in bulk and got kind of a poor quality grader assign a false grade to it. So I think if you're looking at spending a lot of money, particularly on a PSA 10 first edition Charizard, you can have a level of confidence that the population isn't going to get that much higher into the future. Next up's my personal favorite card, the first edition Fossil Dragonite. In 2017, well, from 2017 to 2020, it increased by 151% in population in a PSA 9 and 75% in a PSA 10. Then between 2020 and 2021, it increased by 40% in a PSA 9 and 2.9% in a PSA 10. So if you look at that red PSA 9 population line, you will see that the gradient starts increasing between 2020 and 2021. And that's just showing that the rate of change of PSA 9s is increasing in that period relative to how it was increasing in 2017 to 2020. And that makes a lot of sense, because logically Dragonite is a card you're going to want to get graded, and a lot of people who were brought into the hobby into 2020 probably had one of these cards laying around. On top of that, lots of people were opening first edition fossil boxes and pulling the Dragonite and then grading it. So that makes sense. But what really interests me is that only 2.9% increase in PSA 10s between 2020 and 2021. Only 6 first edition PSA 10 Dragonites were graded last year. And I can't even imagine how many would have been submitted. You look at 2017 to 2020, there was a 75% increase. That rate of change has gone down significantly. And I think that is starting to build a portfolio of evidence to suggest that PSA has definitely increased their grading standards. Let's have a look at the next cards. Now you look at the Snorlax and you get a very similar story where between 2017 and 2020, you've got an increase of 186% in a PSA 9, 47% in a PSA 10. Between 2020 and 21, you got an increase of 33% in a PSA 9, very similar in terms of the rate of change compared to 2017 to 2020. But then you got only a 4% increase in PSA 10s between 2020 and 2021, compared to 47% in the years prior. Now that is definitely a decrease in the rate of change, and only 3 first edition Snorlax PSA 10s were graded in that time period. So we're starting to build this sort of portfolio of evidence that PSA's grading standards have increased between 2020 and 2021. The other word that you might hear thrown around is the word population control. PSA is controlling the population of rare cards. They don't want that population going up too high. And you might be asking the question, why would they do that? What incentive do they have to do that? The reason is because one of the reasons that people grade with PSA is in the hope that the value of their card is going to increase. Now, if you had all of these rare cards that got diluted with new grades and all of a sudden those cards had really high populations, they were no longer rare, the price of those cards would go way down. And then anyone who had that card raw would have less incentive to grade with PSA because they wouldn't be profiting from it as much. So PSA wants to control the population so those cards continuously sell for lots and lots of money, and it creates this perception that PSA's grading is going to increase the value of your cards if you send it to them and get that 10. So it's this kind of bone that they're dangling, carrot, bone, whatever it is, that they're dangling in front of people saying, hey, look, if you grade with us, you might get a PSA 10, and that's going to be a really rare card and it's going to go for lots of money. But the reality is they're really harsh for their grading and they're probably not going to give you the PSA 10, but you're still going to go through that process of paying for their grading service. Now, the next one's really interesting. This is the first edition Gym Challenge Persian, and it's notoriously one of the most difficult cards to grade. Currently sells for about $7,000 USD last time I checked. I think this is just a little bit more evidence showing how much harder it is to get a PSA 10 in 2020 through to 2021. The rate of increase in PSA 10s has definitely decreased. It almost doubled between 2017 and 2020, and then only went up by 7.8% between 2020 and 2021. Now, one thing that is worth noting is that this is actually a really good thing for people who own the PSA 10. So if you bought a PSA 10, you spent a lot of money for it, it's almost like a guarantee that the cards population isn't going to go that much higher. So your investment is sort of protected there. And the other thing you will note is there was this change in culture of collecting PSA 9s to collecting PSA 10s. And the divergence in price from PSA 9 to PSA 10 has just increased, with PSA 10s becoming more and more expensive relative to their PSA 9 counterparts. And the reason for that is because people are realizing that as people are continuously grading, setting in their bulk, that PSA 9 population is going up like crazy, while the PSA 10 population is staying pretty steady. Hey, and another iconic card, you've got the Unlimited Base Set Charizard. Between 2020 and 2021 went up by 66%. In a PSA 9 and 54% in a PSA 10. So they're very similar numbers in terms of percentages for the PSA 9s and PSA 10 increases. Then all of a sudden between 2020 and 2021, 28% were graded in a PSA 9. You'll see again that gradient has increased, and only 2.7% increase in a PSA 10 in that time frame. Only 12 base set unlimited Charizards were graded a PSA 10 between 2020 and 2021. I can't even imagine again how many of these base set Charizards would have been submitted for grading. Everyone has one. And you look at the 9 increase, like there's almost more than 1,300 of these cards were graded in a PSA 9 between 2020 and 2021. A lot of people say, well, why all the fuss about the 5 certs and the 6 certs, which are the cards that were graded between 2020 and 2021. And this is the reason. You can clearly see, particularly for the PSA 10s, the grading standards have gotten just that much harder. And so many of the PSA 10s that were graded in 2017 through to 2020, if you cracked them out of the case and resubmitted them, most of them probably wouldn't even get a 10 anymore. Now let's quickly have a look at the first edition Neo Genesis Slowking. Now this is one of the hardest Wizards of the Coast cards to grade. In 2017, you had 54 in a PSA 9 and 7 in a PSA 10. That increased by 285% in a PSA 9 through to 2020 and up by 42% in a PSA 10, but there's still only 10 that exist. Then between 2020 and 2021, it increased by 30% in a PSA 9. You'll see that gradient stays about the same and it increased by 0% in a PSA 10. There was not a single first edition Neo Genesis Slowking that was graded in a PSA 10 between 2020 and 2021. And again, there would have been a lot submitted. So that is an insane statistic. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that if you own a PSA 10 that has an old certification, it was graded a long time ago, and maybe it's not as strong as some of the current PSA 10s, you'll still be able to sell that card for a lot of money. It will still be worth a lot more than a PSA 9 because we've gotten to a point where there's this culture of people collecting PSA 10s that aren't overly worried about the quality of the card inside. Now, people will pay a little bit more of a premium if it is a really strong PSA 10, but for the most part, people don't really care. And one thing that I've started noticing is that some of these later certs, like the 6 cert PSA 10s that PSA are really, really strict on, some of them would probably start converting through to a BGS Pristine, and that's where you would start getting a serious premium. Now, I find this one really interesting. So in 2017, there was actually more PSA 10s than there was PSA 9s. And in 2020, there was the same amount. So the PSA 9 increase was greater than the PSA 10s. And then now in 2021, there's more PSA 9s than there is PSA 10s, which is how it should be. But again, it's just highlighting that exact same trend that I've been talking about. So let's bring this back to the original question. Are vintage Pokemon cards still rare? I think what we've learned by looking at those couple of popular vintage Pokemon card populations is that there's been an increase to the rate of change in population increases for PSA 9s on average, and a decrease for PSA 10s. Now, the reason for that is because PSA's grading standards are getting harder. They're quote unquote population controlling. And therefore, if you're buying PSA 10s now, the chances are that into the future, the populations of those PSA 10s are going to stay low. Now, I think the other thing to think about here is if you're buying a 5 cert or a 6 cert card, which has been graded between 2020 and 2021, it's being graded under harsher grading standards, so you're probably going to end up with a higher quality card. That doesn't mean that 2 certs aren't going to be the exact same quality, it just means they're going to be more inconsistent. There's going to be cards that slip through the gaps back then. There's going to be less cards that slip through the gaps in that 5-6 cert range. If you sticked around this long, really appreciate it. If you got any questions, feel free to reach out by leaving a comment on this video or hit me up with a DM on my Instagram. It's just PokeRetro. I love making these kinds of videos, and if there's any kind of insights you would like to see in the future, please let me know. I'll see you next time with the Celebi Sanctuary.